Rick Grimes, played by Andrew Lincoln. Then, 37. Now, 52. Lori Grimes, played by Sarah Wayne Callies. Then, 33. Now, 49. Shane Walsh, played by John Bernthal. Then, 34. Now, 49. Andrea, played by Laurie Holden. Then, 40. Now, 56. Carl Grimes, played by Chandler Riggs. Then, 11. Now, 26. Glenn Rhee, played by Stephen Yeun. Then, 26. Now, 42. Carol Pelletier, played by Melissa McBride. Then, 45. Now, 61. T-Dog, played by Irone Singleton. Then, 35. Now, 50. Dale Horvath, played by Jeffrey DeMunn. Then, 64. Now, 79. Merle Dixon, played by Michael Rooker. Then, 55. Now, 71. Morgan Jones, played by Lenny James. Then, 45. Now, 60. Maggie Green, played by Lauren Cohan. Then, 28. Now, 44. Herschel Green, played by Scott Wilson. Then, 68. Passed away in 2018 at age 76. Beth Green, played by Emily Kinney. Then, 25. Now, 40. The Governor, played by David Morrissey. Then, 48. Now, 61. Michonne, played by Denai Guerrera. Then, 34. Now, 48. Sasha Williams, played by Sonequa Martin Green. Then, 28. Now, 41. Tyrese Williams, played by Chad L. Coleman. Then, 39. Now, 54. Abraham Ford, played by Michael Cudlitz. Then, 49. Now, 61. Negan, played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan. Then, 50. Now, 60. Jesus, played by Tom Payne. Then, 28. Now, 43. Eugene Porter, played by Josh McDermott. Then, 34. Now, 47. Gabriel Stokes, played by Seth Gilliam. Then, 45. Now, 57. Tara Chambler, played by Alana Masterson. Then, 25. Now, 37. Dwight, played by Austin Emilio. Then, 28. Now, 40. Aaron, played by Ross Marquand. Then, 34. Now, 44. Jotties, played by Pollyanna McIntosh. Then, 43. Now, 54. Lydia, played by Cassidy McClinky. Then, 18. Now, 25. Gregory, played by Xander Berkeley. Then, 61. Now, 70. Simon, played by Stephen Ogg. Then, 43. Now, 52. King Ezekiel, played by Kari Payton. Then, 45. Now, 54. Enid, played by Caitlin Nacon. Then, 17. Now, 27. Siddiq, played by Avi Nash. Then, 26. Now, 35. Jerry, played by Cooper Andrews. Then, 32. Now, 41. Alpha, played by Samantha Morton. Then, 42. Now, 49. Beta, played by Ryan Hurst. Then, 41. Now, 49. Alden, played by Callan McAuliffe. Then, 21. Now, 30. Judith Grimes, played by Kaylee Fleming. Then, 11. Now, 19. Connie, played by Lauren Ridloff. Then, 41. Now, 48. Daryl Dixon, played by Norman Reedus. Then, 41. Now, 57. Yumiko, played by Eleanor Matsuura. Then, 36. Now, 42. Rosita Espinosa, played by Christian Serratos. Then, 20. Now, 35. Magna, played by Nadia Hilker. Then, 30. Now, 37. Juanita Princess Sanchez, played by Paula Lazaro. Then, 31. Now, 38.